Hi there, it's Mr. Ma, your instructor again. I thought I would take some time at this point to give you a little bit of commentary on Plato's Allegory of the Cave. We've been working on this for a few days now, and I'm really enjoying some of the responses that I'm actually reading from you at this point in your discussion forum. The initial question in your discussion forum was to define the nature of a very simple object, the chair, right? And most of you had some pretty good responses. I mean, they were typical responses, kind of why I gave it to you as a question. Basically, I'm modeling what Plato does in the Allegory of the Cave. I get you to make a supposition about what the simple nature of a chair is, and from that we springboard into a little bit more explanation by sort of question and answer discussion to try and define the nature of that object in the end. And in fact, this is actually what happens in Plato's Allegory of the Cave. Now, by this point, you've read that first reading. You've gone through, hopefully a couple of times now, through that reading. It's a very short piece out of the Republic, out of Plato's The Republic. Realize that Plato's The Republic is actually a fairly large work that's about this thick when you get it in print form. But I've only taken a very small excerpt from it. The 4 pages that I give you really amounts to a couple of paragraphs really out of the entire work. In the Allegory of the Cave, and it's not necessarily titled that in the work, it's just what people have given it as a name to pull out that section very specifically to look at. But the Allegory of the Cave really is a commentary on the nature of our reality and really how that impacts our working lives, all right, in the real world. The allegory is set up with a conversation between 2 characters, all right, the characters of Socrates and Glaucon. Now, these are 2 real people actually in Plato's life. But whether the characters actually are reflective necessarily of who these people actually were is still debatable. In fact, it doesn't really matter in either case, but Socrates being Plato's mentor, teacher, all right, and Glaucon was actually Plato's cousin, I believe. The conversation between the 2 of them here really is just a dialogue between the 2 characters trying to sort out the nature of the reality, all right, in which we live in this world. The excerpt's actually from book 7, and again, there's no concrete indication that these ideas actually belong to Socrates. Oftentimes when you're talking about Plato and Socrates, the 2 names are almost interchangeable. And part of what we're trying to deconstruct here is an analysis of, the pursuit of truth and beauty and, the concept of wisdom. I'm going to get you to look at the reading at this point, and we'll do sort of maybe a paragraph or line by line kind of analysis of it. And this is what I would do in a normal classroom setting as well. So if you look on page 1, right down towards the bottom, we actually have Socrates say these lines, and I want you to kind of follow along because that'll actually help you to gel some of this reading in your own minds as well. So Socrates picks up at the bottom of page 1 here in your textbook, and it says here, "And now look again, and see what will naturally follow it. The prisoners are released and disabused of their error. And at first, when any of them is liberated and compelled suddenly to stand up and turn his neck around and walk and look towards the light, he will suffer sharp pains. The glare will distress him, and he will be unable to see the realities of which his former state he had seen the shadows, and then conceive someone saying to him that what he saw before was an illusion, but that now, when he is approaching nearer to being and his eye is turned towards more real existence, he has a clearer vision. What will be his reply? And you may further imagine that his instructor is pointing to the objects as they pass and requiring him to name them. Will he not be perplexed? Will he not fancy that the shadows which he formerly saw are truer than objects which are now shown him? And so in this part of the dialogue, the initial setup that Socrates gives to Glaucon, kind of making him imagine and picture this scene. And some of you have already looked at the video sort of rendition of this allegory and have listened to the other lecture as well. And you get this idea, this painted sort of picture in your mind of, you know, these poor souls that are chained up in a cave and they're forced to look at this wall. And he goes on a little further to say that if he's, you know, that the prisoners are chained, they're looking at this wall, and all they see are these sort of vague, shadowy sort of you know, objects that are passing in front of them and so on. And you know, as the objects move from side to side or, you know, start interacting and so on and so forth, the sort of phantom instructor behind them starts, you know, telling them, hey, you know, this is what you're actually seeing. And, you know, just sort of giving those prisoners only sort of a one-sided view here. And so the prisoner, and prisoners, right, and, you know, more perhaps we'll look at one prisoner very specifically here, is confused, right? He starts looking at these objects and starts questioning perhaps, you know, what are these things? And then what happens is that prisoner breaks free, right? That prisoner somehow comes to a realization saying, hey, there's something funny about this situation. There's something funny going on here. And so he decides that he is just going to look around, all right? So instead of being the, you know, the same sort of person that everyone else beside him is, just sort of looking straight at the wall and only interpreting, you know, what people are telling them the shadows are, he decides to take it upon himself to actually look around and see perhaps what's creating those shadows. And so when he first says that he's compelled suddenly to stand up and turn his neck around and walk towards the light, we have this prisoner that decides to break free and starts exploring the world around him. Starts trying to figure out what it is that he's really supposed to be seeing here. And of course that initial shock, right, is something that's causing him some great pain, right? So it says he'll suffer sharp pains and the glare distresses him and so on and so forth. And so the prisoner wanders around for a little bit, kind of confused as to what he's looking at. And so what happens is, you know, this, hopefully, you know, this teacher, this instructor comes to him and says, hey, you know, this is what these objects really are. And tells him very specifically, okay, so this is what you're looking at. You're looking at, you know, let's go back to our example. You're looking at a chair, you're looking at a table, and so on. And of course, again, the prisoner is very confused about this because all the prisoner's ever known about tables and chairs and such are those shadowy things on the wall. All right. So when you look at a shadow on the wall, it's very difficult to sort of understand what it really is. You know, just for as a silly example, right? You know, look behind me here, right? And if you look at the wall, and you know, I've got this light that, you know, creates a shadow, and you know, if all we were ever able to see was just simply the shadow, right? So if I go up in here, right, and all you happen to see are, you know, the shadow cast behind and these shadowy shapes and that sort of thing, you would never know really what was causing it. It isn't until you turn around and start looking at the light, right, at this object in the light, that you start to see, oh, hey, you know, it's a hand that's creating the shadow here. So the prisoner is actually starting to face the reality of what's creating the shadows instead of just the shadows themselves. And this is, again, confusing to him because, again, all he's ever really known are the shadowy things that he's been forced to look at. Now, if that prisoner happens to be compelled to look straight at the light source itself, right, and goes on a little further to say, and Socrates picks up and he says, if he's compelled to look straight at the light, will he not have a pain in his eyes which will make him turn away and take in the objects of the vision which he can see, and which he will conceive to be in reality clearer than the things which are now being shown to him? And so now the prisoner starts to realize that perhaps those objects, right, that he only knew as sort of shadowy things on the wall are now perhaps a lot clearer, right, in the natural light. And then he goes on a little further, and the prisoner makes an ascent out of the cave. right? So it's kind of an education process, right? He starts off very slowly, just kind of looking at objects where the light is still kind of, fuzzy, and the objects, well, not just shadows on the wall are now the actual objects. He's still kind of in the middle of the cave, and things are kind of dark and fuzzy and hazy, and he's only kind of getting a small sense of what the reality of these objects is. And so the wise instructor starts pulling the disabused prisoner out of the cave, right? And so eventually he starts emerging out into the upper world, and Socrates goes on to say he'll require to grow accustomed, right, to the sight of the upper world. And first you'll see the shadows best, and then next the reflections of men and other objects in the water, and then the objects themselves. And then he'll gaze upon the light of the moon and the stars and the spangled heaven, and he'll see the sky and the stars by night better than the sun or the light of the sun by day. And basically what Socrates is getting at, Plato is getting at here, is the fact that our education sort of process, when we start understanding the world around us better than sort of our initial perceptions, is that it's a slow process. It's one that takes a bit of work, effort, and is oftentimes, again, confusing for us. I mean, think about your own education when you're introduced to, say, a complex concept in your physics class, right? The very first, what happens is you're introduced to this by your instructor, and you kind of give the instructor kind of a funny look and go, what the heck are you talking about, right? You're very confused at first when some of those new complex concepts are sort of given to you. And what happens is you start working with it a little bit more every day, and your instructor tries to enlighten you a little bit, and you decide to work out some problems with your physics formulas and that sort of thing, and eventually you get to know that a whole lot better. And so the whole idea of looking at reality is the same way. What we do is we see new things in front of us, or new objects. We're introduced to new concepts of things in the world, and we're confused at first, and it takes a lot of work and a lot of sort of attacking it from this side, that perspective, and trying to really grasp a hold of it until finally we understand what it actually is. Finally coming to that understanding is looking at things in the light of day, right? If you were going to go with that sort of comparison. A little further on, Socrates says, last of all, he'll be able to see the sun and not mere reflections of him in the water. But he will see him in his own proper place and not in another, and he will contemplate him as he is. And so here now we have the prisoner coming to a full realization of the reality around him. We go on a little further to say, when he remembered his old habitation and the wisdom of the den and his fellow prisoners, do you not suppose that he would facilitate himself on the change and pity them? So that statement there actually brings us towards this realization that the prisoner has actually come to a full understanding of the world around him. And now he's starting to recall what it was like back in the cave, right, with the previous, life that he led with the other prisoners. And then he wonders, well, should that person actually pity, the other prisoners and their lack of knowledge and understanding of the world? And of course, right, of course he would pity them and, realize that they're the poor ignorant masses at this point. And at the bottom of page 2, you'll see Socrates. He goes on to say, and if there were a contest, and he had to compete in measuring the shadows with the prisoners, who had never moved out of the den, while his sight was still weak and before his eyes had become steady, and the time which would be needed to acquire his new habit of sight might be very considerable, would he not be ridiculous? Men would say of him that up he went, and down he came without his eyes, and that it was better not even to think of ascending. And if one tried to free another and lead him up to the light, let them only catch the offender, and they would put him to death. And, this might actually be a commentary on Socrates' demise in the end. If you've looked at the, history books, right, and history of philosophy and that sort of thing. Socrates as a historical figure, ended up, being put to death for, corrupting the youth, basically, is what happened. Socrates as a teacher, one of those enlightened souls of the world that kind of understood the world around him, had that sort of knowledge about what reality was really all about, started bringing some of those other prisoners out of the cave, basically. Educating, the likes of Plato and Aristotle and so on. And so the idea here is that with Socrates' demise, the idea of the prisoner being, branded a kind of heretic, right? And, the idea that if somebody was to free another and lead them up into the light, because of the fact that, the enlightened soul can't seem to make it back with the rest of the old poor souls again, leads them to think that they're wrong, right? And that they should really be punished and kept away, and they really shouldn't be corrupting the others. Because if the prisoners are in their cave and they're ignorant and left to their own devices, the world kind of works on its own. Whereas when you start disrupting the flow, that's when you have problems, basically. Now, Socrates goes on a little further right after that and says, "This entire allegory you may now append, dear Glaucon, to the previous argument. The prison house is the world of sight. The light is the fire. Right? The light of the fire is the sun. And you'll not misapprehend me if you interpret the journey upwards to be the ascent of the soul into the intellectual world, according to my poor belief, which at your desire I've expressed, whether rightly or wrongly, God knows. But whether true or false, my opinion is that the world of knowledge, the idea of good, appears last of all, and is seen only with an effort. And when seen, is also inferred to be the universal author of all things beautiful and right, parent of light and the lord of light in this visible world, and the immediate source of reason and truth in the intellectual, and that this is the power upon which he who would act rationally either in public or private life must have his eye fixed." And so now we have this whole allegory dispelled for Glaucon, right? The idea that, the objects that we encounter, all those things we take for granted as our understanding of the world really are mere shadows. The idea that nothing that we know of the world we have any real understanding of. We look at this, simple example that I've been getting to work with about tables and chairs and that sort of thing. The whole of the allegory and how it applies is just the fact that all of us in this world, right, according to what Plato is trying to tell us here, is that all of us in the world are the ignorant masses. We are the prisoners in the cave. Most of you got that, very quickly right away. It's not like it's not like it's a complicated metaphor here, right? But the idea is, while it's a very simple idea, it's something that we oftentimes take for granted, and that's the point. Right, that what we see in our reality as to what a chair is or what a table is, we only know very superficially. Right? When you start looking at your own discussions and the things that you've actually been posting about chairs, right, and the idea that I got you to find a chair, and immediately the very simple answer is oh well, a chair's got 4 legs, a flat surface, a back, so you can sort of sit on it, right? To Plato, this is the superficial, version of what we understand to be a chair. Because I could very easily, and I told you in the discussion boards as well already, that, does a chair necessarily have to have 4 legs? No. I showed you an example where a chair had 5 legs. I could show you a chair that has 3 legs. I could show you a chair that has 1 leg. I could show you a chair that has no legs. All right? And the thing is they're all still classified as chairs. You could have a chair with a back or without a back, right? Is a chair something that you sit on? Perhaps, right? Function as being one of those qualities that's necessary for a chair, but You know, we also looked at examples where I showed you the art piece, for instance. It was like a pants hanger or something like that. You know, here's an example of a chair that's very easily identified as a chair, but isn't being used as one. No one ever sits in it. One of the funnier sights that I ever remember seeing was if you ever go to the Art Gallery of Ontario. I don't know if the exhibit's still there or not anymore, but there's this wonderful exhibit in the modern art section where basically it's a vacuum formed piece of plastic that was done around a chair. A very simple wooden chair would have been, and they vacuum formed this plastic piece around it, and then they took the chair out and they put this piece of plastic and they mounted it on the wall. And you see, the thing is it looks like a chair. In fact, you know, and it's the most exactest detail possible, it looks like a chair. But with it being posted on the wall, no one ever possibly ever going to sit in it. Is it a chair? You might argue that no, it's not a chair, it's a piece of art. Yet, when I walk into the room and I say, hey, look at that chair on the wall, none of you have any problem whatsoever identifying that thing as being a chair. You know, I showed you an example where we had this, you know, pile of wood that was kind of strewn about on the road. And I said, hey, look at this chair. It's a broken chair, but it's a chair. And you know, none of you are going to have any problem looking at that picture where the chair is all disassembled in various pieces, but you can still identify it for what it actually is, a chair. It's not going to be used as a chair. You know, the parts, the way they're configured is nothing like a chair, yet we can still use the nomenclature of a chair and it doesn't throw us for a loop whatsoever. So, what is it? What is it about the chair that makes it what it is? Because it can't be any one of those qualities of it having four legs. It can't be quality of it having a flat surface. It can't be the quality of it having, you know, wood or metal. It can't be any of the qualities of it, you know, being a matter of a function of it, you being able to sit in it, right? None of these things make it a chair. And that's one of the sort of problematic things about what we're looking at. Is how do we define the object? But not only a chair. I mean, any object that we actually look at, we're trying to figure out what its essential qualities happen to be. You know, you can extend this from a chair to a table to, you know, any of the objects in front of you to the people that you interact with. What makes them what they are or who they are? This is one of the fundamental problems of, you know, understanding that reality around us, is figuring out how to qualify them. So what Plato tries to get us to realize is that there is actually more than what meets the eye here when it comes to our understanding of the world. A lot of things we just take for granted. So understanding what a chair is, well, again, if you take away all of those qualities that you've, you know, sort of identified as being a chair, well, what are you left with? Right? What are you left with that actually makes it what it is? So Plato eventually comes to this idea, and this is what some of the other, you know, lectures you've been looking at have talked about, is that's the idea of Plato's forms, right? The form is basically the object's, how should we call it, essence, right? For lack of any sort of better term, let's just call it that, right? Let's call it, you know, the essence of the object. So the chair has an essence, right? The chair has its kind of chairness, right? The table has its kind of tableness that makes it what it is. And it's that underlying quality, whatever it happens to be, that allows us to classify and categorize these objects for what they are. So why don't I have a problem identifying what a chair is? Even though a chair can have 4 legs, 3 legs, it could be wood, it could be metal, it could have a flat surface, it could be used to sit on, or might not be used to sit on, it might be used to stand on, or so on and so forth. It doesn't matter what any of these qualities are. There's something about a chair that makes it what it is. I can't put my finger on it necessarily or describe it, but I have some innate understanding of what that happens to be. And so when Plato talks about the prisoner being sort of disabused of his error and not understanding the world that he sees around him, right? The fact that all of these things are shadows. Well, Plato's making a commentary about how we see reality, right? My understanding of a chair is not based on those shadows of, you know, a chair having 4 legs, the shadow of it having a back, or the shadow of it being made of wood, or, right? The qualities are the shadows, right? The qualities that we ascribe to an object are the shadows. Seeing beyond those shadows and understanding what the essence of the object is really what the prisoners are trying to figure out, and what the prisoner is trying to figure out. In fact, the prisoner is actually what we are as philosophers, trying to figure out the nature of reality around us, understanding those underlying essences of an object or of the reality around us. And so really, when it comes down to it, you know, defining the essences of objects isn't a difficult thing. It's not supposed to be a difficult thing. It's difficult to get beyond, you know, understanding the reality under the shadows. But really, the knowledge that we have of the essences of objects is innate. It's actually something that we have always known. It's something that is inherent in our own being. So when it comes to understanding the world, we're not really learning so much about the world around us as we're really kind of rediscovering what we should already know, right? We're just sort of putting under the microscope something that's already been with us since we started our journey, our lives, right? And so that's really what Plato's getting at with the forms, all right, is the idea that we're talking about essences. So now if you look at page 3, all right, of your text here, Socrates says, "But then, if I'm right, certain professors of education must be wrong when they say that they can put knowledge into the soul, which was not there before, like sight into blind eyes. Whereas our argument shows that the power and capacity of learning exists in the soul already, and that just as the eye was unable to turn from darkness to light without the whole body, so too the instrument of knowledge can only by the movement of the whole soul be turned from the world of becoming into that of being, and learn by degrees to endure the sight of being, and of the brightest and best of being, or in other words, of the good." And he goes on to page 4 a little bit further and says, "And whereas the other so-called virtues of the soul seem akin to bodily qualities, for even when they are not originally innate, they can be implanted later by habit and exercise. Thereof wisdom, more than anything else, contains a divine element, which always remains, and by this conversion is rendered useful and profitable, or on the other hand hurtful and useless." And so the idea here, you know, goes back to this idea that understanding the world around us is not so much something that's taught to us, right? We never discover the reality of our world around us by being taught, not according to Plato anyway. Our understanding of the world comes from our discovering it, our actually actively pursuing that knowledge of essences underneath, about being able to see beyond the qualities of an object, or of the people that we deal with, or, you know, etc., right, the world around us, by looking a little further beyond, right, what we see and what we hear, and beyond anything that we can kind of sense. And so the idea of the knowledge of those objects being innate is really what Plato is telling us here. He goes on a little further to talk about, you know, the idea of, you know, some of the qualities, you know, not being originally innate can be implanted later by habit and exercise. You know, here he talks a little bit about what we might refer to as wisdom. And I think wisdom, actually, when Plato started talking about this a little further, is really about the idea of exercising knowledge, right? Knowledge is one thing. Being able to understand the chairness of a chair, or the tableness of a table, that's coming to some sort of knowledge about that object, right? Understanding the object for what it happens to actually be, beyond the qualities that you see, that you can touch, that you can hear, taste, you know, grab hold of, and that sort of thing. The idea of, you know, seeing the knowledge, seeing the essence of an object is only part of the way, part of the sort of journey right, that Plato would like us to take in our sort of understanding of the world. What Plato would like to see us do with knowledge is actually something more fitting with the rest of the Republic, right, as a whole work. Again, we're only looking at the small little snippet of the allegory of the cave, but there's actually a whole grand context which this allegory is supposed to fit into. And this is actually where Plato starts going with this idea of the prisoner having come to an understanding of the world, having that knowledge of the world around him, needs to do something with it. All right? It's not sufficient for the prisoner at this point, or the prisoner that's been dragged to the cave and sees reality for what it is. It's not sufficient for that character to just simply bask in the knowledge of the world, right? Just knowing having that understanding. Having that understanding, just keeping it to yourself, is actually what Plato refers to as being, evil, really. The good that Plato refers to here is the idea of taking that knowledge, that understanding of the world, and actually trying to bring it to others. Now, is Plato one that says naively that, the disabused prisoner is going to be able to free all the others and bring them all out into perfect knowledge of the world and that sort of thing? No. I mean, Plato has no sort of illusion as to the fact that he's going to be able to do this. But he can't be, again, satisfied in the fact that he's got all this knowledge and doesn't do anything with it. And so Plato talks a little bit about the quality of wisdom. And that's the idea of taking that knowledge and, trying to spread the word and trying to use it to actually bring others to a better place. And so in the context of the whole of the Republic, we're now starting to look at it as a political science work, which is really what the Republic is actually about. We start looking at the Republic as a sort of model for how we should run societies, right? How we administer the city-state is basically what Plato starts to get at here. And so taking that knowledge and bring it to others is not so much a matter of making everyone knowledgeable, but it's just about making people somewhat knowledgeable and then being able to sort of differentiate between there and giving people a little bit of direction as to where they go. Instead of sort of following things blindly, maybe they have a slight bit of understanding here and there about what the world is around, and it makes the world a better place. Bringing that knowledge to others in whatever form or fashion is what I think Plato starts to get towards when he talks about wisdom. There's only a few people that are capable of this. All right. Plato really is talking about the one or two people, maybe even only the one person that ever manages to break free of the chains of the cave and bring themselves to that knowledge and exercise the wisdom by bringing that knowledge to others and using it to shape the world around them and so on. All right. Perhaps it's only that one person. And that one person is what Plato, eventually, or what people, that study Plato eventually term the philosopher king. And I'm sure you've all heard of that term before. The idea of the philosopher king is the one that's able to manage, all right, the city-state based on their idea that they understand the world more deeply than anyone else. And so towards the latter part of this allegory, so if we look, say, at page 4 here, down where Socrates says, "Yes, and there is another thing which is likely, or rather a necessary inference from what has preceded, that neither the uneducated and uninformed of the truth, nor yet those who never make an end of their education, will be able ministers of state, not the former, because they have no single aim of duty, which is the rule of all their actions, public or private as well as public, nor the latter, because they will not act at all except upon compulsion, fancying that they are already dwelling apart from the others on the islands of the blessed. Then the business of us who are the founders of the state will be to compel the best minds to attain that knowledge, which have already shown to be the greatest of all, that they must continue to ascend until they arrive at the good. But when they have ascended and seen enough, we must not allow them to do as they do now. I mean that they remain in the upper world, but this must not be allowed. They must be made to descend in among the prisoners in the den, and partake their labors and honors, whether they are worth having or not. So this section of the Republic, the Allegory, this latter part, really again talks about that bringing of the knowledge, right? The fact that the disabused prisoner can't just sit there and revel in knowledge and bask in the glow of knowing more than the rest of them, right? This does no one any good. And so, Plato says that really those people really have to be forced to descend, right? To go back to the cave, to try to shape the world to make it a better place, right? And so towards the bottom here, Socrates again goes a little bit further and says, "Wherefore each of you, when his turn comes, must go down to the general underground abode, and get into the habit of seeing in the dark. When you have acquired the habit, you will see 10,000 times better than the inhabitants of the den. And you will know that the several images are and what they represent, because you've seen the beautiful and just and good in their truth. And thus, our state, which is also yours, will be a reality, not a dream only. Whereas the truth is that the state in which the rulers are most reluctant to govern is always the best and most quietly governed, and the state in which they are most eager the worst." And so really, when we talk about the quote-unquote philosopher king, that one that actually does go back into the cave to try and shape the world, to make it a better place, to run the state in a better way, really again is about the bigger context of the Republic, that knowledge, bringing that knowledge and acting wisdom, is really how we run that city-state better, right? This is the ideal state. This is really the way government should be run. That oftentimes people that are in government, that make up the rules and that sort of thing, oftentimes aren't fit to do so. They want to make the rules, right? And one of those things that Socrates says at the end here is that the ones that are eager to govern are sometimes the worst people that we actually have in government, because they're not looking towards making the world a better place or helping others to see their sort of vision and make things better. Really, they're kind of in it for their own reasons, right? Kind of self-serving, self-purposed, and that sort of thing. Whereas the one that is truly enacting wisdom, through their understanding of the world, through their knowledge, are the ones that are reluctant to govern, because really they want to be in that place where they're knowledgeable about the world, but not necessarily forced amongst the prisoners that are going to necessarily, that might necessarily harm them. The ones that are actually going to not accept their vision of the world around them, and so on. And so the idea is that, that person that doesn't want to govern is oftentimes the one that's best suited to govern, because they have that knowledge of the world and they're willing to share it, right? So that's really where we're at, right, when it comes to this idea of the allegory of the cave. Again, it simply boils down to the idea that the world around us is not necessarily what we take it for granted it actually is, that there's something underneath that binds that world together. And again, it goes beyond even our simple examples of what the chair is and what the table is, and its chairness and tableness, but the world itself, right? The universe around us. There's some sort of essential quality or underlying understanding of that world that we need to have in order to make the world a better place, right? In order for us to govern our world better, we have to understand it. And so the Republic really is sort of a roadmap that helps us to see that, yes, these are the people that actually need to be in charge, right? The ones that are actually able to see beyond our mere superficial understanding, knowledge. And so really that's where we leave it, at least, with the allegory. But when you, again, put that in context with the rest of the Republic, you'll see that there's lots of other stuff in the Republic that talks about how government systems will work, and why certain people are suited to do these jobs, and there's a whole classification system and so on and so forth, which we don't get into at this point. But take a political science course and you'll actually see all that stuff. So if you have any further questions or concerns about the allegory, keep posting on the discussion board or whatever for a little while yet. So I hope this has been a useful lecture for you on Plato's Allegory of the Cave. I'm looking forward to some more of your discussion posts in our next discussion.